It was supposed to be a quiet anniversary dinner. Tasha and her husband Lionel had worked hard their whole lives, and tonight they just wanted to feel like they belonged. But from the moment they sat down, something felt off. The waiter ignored them, the manager brushed them aside, and not a single person spoke up. What no one knew was who Lionel really was, and when the truth finally came out, that restaurant would never be the same again. Stay with this video because what this couple faces next will leave you stunned. And the truth, it was sitting in that restaurant the entire time waiting to be seen. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. Tasha Benson stepped out of the car first, smoothing down the front of her blouse while her husband Lionel locked the doors behind her. The restaurant sat on a quiet downtown corner, warm lights in the windows, a polished black awning stretched over the front door. It was their 20th anniversary, and though they didn't care much for fancy places, Lionel had made the reservation a week ago after reading a few solid reviews online. It had only reopened a month earlier after a long remodel. Tasha had been curious to see what they did with the space. She reached for Lionel's hand. As they walked up the short steps, his grip was steady, calm always was. They stepped inside together, the entryway filled with soft jazz and the faint scent of rosemary and grilled meat. But no one looked up. A young couple stood ahead of them, both white early 20s dressed in jeans and sneakers. The host behind the stand smiled and waved them over right away, flipping a few pages in the book and guiding them inside. Another staff member in a white apron passed right by Tasha and Lionel without a glance. They waited, then waited some more. 2 minutes. 5. Lionel stepped forward and cleared his throat gently. Still nothing. The host had returned, but now he was talking to a man in a blazer by the bar, laughing over something on his phone. Tasha's smile faded a little. She tilted her head. "Should we go ask?" she said softly. Lionel nodded once and walked forward. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but polite. "We have a reservation under Benson." The host barely looked up before he could even check the list. A waiter with close-cropped blonde hair stepped forward from the side and blocked their view of the stand. His name tag read Chet. He glanced over them quickly, then said, "We're not seating walk-ins tonight." Lionel blinked. "We're not walk-ins? We booked it last week." Chet raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Got proof of that?" Lionel pulled out his phone, tapped the app, and held it up. The reservation glowed on the screen, 7:30 p.m. L. Benson window table. Chet barely glanced at it before letting out a short laugh. "We've had a lot of fake confirmations this week. You can wait over by the bar, I guess, but no promises." He didn't lower his voice. Two older women at a nearby table turned to look. Tasha felt heat rise to her cheeks but stayed quiet. She reached for Lionel's arm. He looked at her, gave a slight nod, and they stepped aside together. They stood near the bar, ignored, while another group walked in behind them this time. Two young men in business jackets, and were immediately shown to a table by the window. Tasha said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. Lionel reached into his pocket and slipped his phone back in jaw, tightening just slightly. Chet never looked back. They stood quietly near the bar, close enough to smell the citrus peel lining someone's half-finished drink. A cold breeze slipped in every time the door opened behind them. Tasha crossed her arms, then let them fall. Her heels ached. Lionel leaned against the wall, watching the host laugh again, with the bartender as if nothing had happened. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The table they had supposedly reserved, the one marked window in the app, had been taken by a blonde woman in a red coat and a man with salt and pepper hair. They were already sipping wine and browsing the menu. Tasha followed their waiter with her eyes. It wasn't Chet. She turned toward Lionel and whispered, "Do they not want us here?" Her voice barely carried over the low music. Lionel glanced toward her. "I think they already made that clear." Just then, Chet came back, waving two menus loosely in one hand. "All right," he said flatly. "I found a spot. Follow me." He turned without waiting for a response, heading straight past the main floor and toward the back near the swinging kitchen doors. Tasha hesitated. Lionel touched the small of her back, guiding her forward. The table Chet stopped at was cramped, tucked between a noisy utility cart and a dusty sideboard where used glasses sat. The seat backs didn't match. One wobbled as Tasha lowered herself into it. She looked across the room. Every other couple was seated in the main dining area, where the lights were warmer, the windows wider, and the hum of conversation gentler. Tasha opened her mouth, then paused. Would it be possible to sit near the front instead? She asked gently. We had asked for a window table when we booked. Chet didn't even glance at her. Those are reserved for regulars, he muttered, tossing the menus down like flyers. One slid halfway off the table. Then he walked away without another word. Tasha sat still for a moment, staring at the edge of the menu hanging off the side. Lionel reached over and pushed it back in place. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. The sound of silverware and low laughter filled the air around them, but their table stayed quiet, too quiet. Lionel shifted in his chair, the cushion uneven beneath him. Tasha sat back, eyes unfocused, as another tray of drinks passed them by. No one offered them water. No one greeted them properly. They had been seated, yes, but not served, not welcomed, not seen. Tasha folded her hands in her lap, her fingers gently picking at the corner of her napkin. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't calm either. A kind of quiet. Embarrassment had started building in her chest, the kind that made her feel both too visible and completely invisible at the same time. The kind that crept into her shoulders and made her feel smaller in her own clothes. Across from her, Lionel stayed still. His menu lay untouched. He wasn't looking around like she was. He wasn't fidgeting or sighing. But his jaw was locked and she could see the small muscle twitching near his temple. That was enough to tell her how he felt. The waiter Chet passed by them twice, carrying drinks to other tables. He didn't glance their way. Another couple who had just been seated, this time two college-age girls in hoodies, already had tall glasses of iced tea in front of them and were chatting with a waitress who smiled easily. Tasha watched the girl laugh as she refilled their water glasses. They hadn't even been there 5 minutes. She leaned toward Lionel, her voice low. He's not coming back. Lionel looked at her, then down at his watch. It's been over 20 minutes. Tasha's throat tightened. Do you want to leave? Lionel looked past her toward the front of the restaurant, where a soft buzz of laughter and forks scraping against plates created a rhythm that seemed completely removed from their side of the room. Not yet, he said. Not like this. Tasha looked at him carefully. There was a tone in his voice she hadn't heard all night. Not frustration, not defeat. Something colder, quieter. Like he had already made a decision but wasn't ready to say it yet. Another few minutes passed, still no service. A waiter in a dark green apron brushed past their table and nearly bumped into Tasha's chair. He didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge her. She blinked hard, willing herself not to tear up. Not in here, not over this. Her hand slid down to the strap of her purse, and her fingers tapped nervously against the leather. Lionel finally moved. He leaned back in his chair and pulled his phone from his coat pocket. No dramatic movements, no anger in his face, just calm precision. He tapped the screen a few times and typed a message Tasha watched, but didn't ask. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the shift. He slipped the phone back in and looked at her. You okay? He asked. She nodded, but her voice cracked just slightly. I just wanted tonight to feel special. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It still can, he said softly. But they both knew it wouldn't, not like this. Not unless something changed. Behind them, the kitchen door swung open again, letting out a burst of clattering pans and a short barked command in a man's voice. Chet walked out carrying a tray of drinks, heading toward a group of middle-aged men in golf shirts seated in the center of the room. As he passed, Lionel raised a hand. Chet rolled his eyes mid-step and said without stopping, I'll be with you when I can. His tone was dry, annoyed like they were a problem he hadn't asked for. Tasha turned her head away, her face burning. Lionel didn't say a word. He just looked down at the table, then slowly back, toward the entrance of the restaurant. And when his phone buzzed in his pocket 3 minutes later, he didn't even smile. He just read the screen, nodded once and whispered to himself, All right then. The air felt heavier now. The kitchen door kept swinging open and shut behind them, sending short gusts of hot air over their table that carried the smell of burnt garlic and grease. Tasha stared down at the menu, though she wasn't reading it. The text blurred behind a thin layer of sting in her eyes. She blinked it back, chewing lightly on the inside of her cheek to ground herself. She had dressed carefully tonight, taken her time with her curls chosen, silver earrings that matched the thin necklace Lionel gave her 3 years ago. This wasn't just dinner, this was their 20th anniversary. 20 years of holding each other up through layoffs, through parenthood, through illness, through life. And now they were here in a space that acted like they didn't belong in it, that refused to see them not as customers, not as a couple, not even as people. A small laugh broke out across the room. The hostess had just taken a group of 4 young adults to the center of the floor, a booth that had been empty when Tasha and Lionel arrived. One of them looked over his shoulder and locked eyes with Tasha for half a second. He looked away just as quickly. She didn't know what made her angrier, the blatant disregard from the staff or the silence from everyone else who had clearly seen it. There was a kind of social fog in this place, the kind where people knew something wasn't right, but no one wanted to be the one to break the mood by saying so. So they all looked away, or worse, pretended they hadn't noticed at all. She leaned forward, her voice almost too low to hear. "Lionel, are we really staying?" He looked up from his phone. "You want to leave?" She hesitated. "I want to feel like we matter." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled, not heavily but slowly. "We do," he said. "But they don't know that yet." There was something in his tone, that same patient steadiness he always carried, but now it came with weight, not pride exactly. More like preparation, like he had already started something behind the scenes. She studied his face. He didn't look upset, not in the way most people showed it. No flushed cheeks, no loud sighs, no foot tapping. But his stillness wasn't peaceful, it was deliberate. Something was moving inside him, and it was waiting for the right time to surface. Just then a loud clatter broke the quiet. Someone had dropped a glass near the bar. Shards glittered across the floor, and the manager rushed over, apologizing quickly to a well-dressed man whose pants were now speckled with water and lemon pulp. The staff swarmed to clean it up, stepping over themselves in their rush. No one looked toward the back table where Tasha and Lionel sat still unserved, still unseen. She rubbed her hands together. "Has not coming back, is he?" Lionel didn't answer. He pulled his phone out again, typed quickly and hit send. Tasha tilted her head. "Who are you texting?" He slid the phone into his pocket and looked across the room. "Someone who can fix this." She raised her eyebrows. "You mean like file a complaint?" Lionel's eyes didn't move. "No," he said quietly. "I mean fix it." The kitchen door creaked again as Chet came out with another tray, laughing at something a nearby customer said. He walked past their table without a glance. That was the last straw. Lionel stood up. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave anyone over. He just pushed in his chair with calm precision and walked toward the host stand, his shoulders square, his steps. Even Tasha watched him go, her chest tight. She didn't know what he was about to do. Not exactly, but she trusted him. She always had. Still, her fingers fidgeted on the edge of her napkin as her thoughts turned. What if they kicked him out? What if it got worse? What if the entire evening, everything they had looked forward to, just collapsed? But then the front doors opened, and everything changed. The bell above the restaurant's door gave a soft chime as it opened, but it rang louder than anything that had come before it. Tasha looked up just as Lionel turned his head toward the entrance. A tall man stepped inside, brushing a fine mist of rain from the shoulders of his navy wool coat. His presence shifted something in the room, not because he made a scene, but because he didn't need to. He moved like someone used to being listened to, like someone who didn't ask for space. He expected it. Tasha didn't recognize him at first. His face was familiar, though, in the way of a photograph that's been on the edge of your memory for years. He had a calm intensity, the kind of man who never had to speak twice to be heard. He scanned the room once. Then his eyes landed on Lionel, who had just reached the host stand. A quick, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. No handshake, no greetings. Just that quiet acknowledgement. The kind of exchange that said, "This has already been discussed." Tasha sat up straighter in her seat. The hostess began to speak, but the man in the navy coat didn't stop for her. He passed the podium, ignoring the reservation book, and headed straight toward Lionel. The two stood side by side now, and the room had taken notice. Several diners glanced over their menus. One of the bartenders froze mid-pour. The manager emerged from the back hallway, her mouth halfway open to greet someone, but then stopped when she saw who it was. Tasha's pulse picked up. The man placed a hand on Lionel's shoulder. "You good?" he asked, voice low. Not sharp, but firm enough to carry. Lionel nodded once. Better now. Chet came around the corner at that moment carrying a bottle of white wine and 2 glasses. He nearly walked into them and stopped short. "Oh, Hookchen, I help you guys?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his words came out too fast. The man turned slowly toward him. "You're the one who seated the Bensons?" Chet blinked. "The who?" He pointed a thumb toward Tasha's table, where she now sat frozen, unsure whether to stay, seated or stand. A few heads had turned her way. The quiet hum of the dining room had dimmed. The energy had shifted, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp, like the moment before a thunderclap. Chet looked toward Tasha, his expression uncertain, then back at Lionel. "I didn't realize they were with you," he mumbled. "They're not with me." The man replied, his voice a little firmer now. "They're co-owners of this location." The silence broke like a snapped string. The manager stepped forward, her face flushing. "Tu wasn't informed." Lionel raised a hand. "That's the problem." Tasha pressed her fingers into her thighs beneath the table. Her mind spun. Co-owners, when had that happened? She searched Lionel's face from across the room, but he didn't look at her. He was watching Chet, and Chet was shrinking by the second. "I believe Mr. Benson and his wife were placed near the kitchen," the man said, not even looking at Chet anymore. "Despite their reservation, despite their on-time arrival, despite the fact that they own part of this business." The hostess stepped backward slightly as if trying to disappear behind the podium. Chet opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Tasha finally stood. Her chair scraped gently against the floor. "I'd like to speak to the manager in private," Lionel said, turning to the woman in the black blazer. She nodded quickly, the smile on her face, a forced shield. The man in the coat looked toward Tasha and gave a soft smile, the first she had seen on his face. "Mrs. Benson," he said, "please come with me. I believe your table is ready." He led her past the stunned diners, past Chet, past the employees who couldn't seem to meet her gaze. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. Her steps were slow measured. Her heels clicked gently against the hardwood as she passed by. Faces that had an hour ago looked through her like she was furniture. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look satisfied. She looked steady, like someone who didn't need to raise her voice to change the temperature in the room. And just before she reached the new table, the one at the front with white linens and fresh-cut flowers, she passed Lionel as he followed the manager into the hallway. He gave her a look that said everything. Now they know the table was flawless. A polished walnut surface, soft overhead, lighting, and a large window that opened to the quiet, rainy street outside. Tasha eased into the high-backed chair, feeling the subtle cushion give beneath her. A single flickering candle sat in the center, its glow reflected in her glass of water, which had already been poured by a sharply dressed server who now stood silently nearby. She didn't touch anything yet. Not the menu, not the napkin, not even the water. Her hands rested in her lap and she stared through the glass at the sidewalk beyond, where the rain had begun to fall heavier. Streetlights shimmered across wet pavement. Everything outside looked soft and slow, peaceful even, but inside her body buzzed with everything that had gone unsaid. She still hadn't fully processed what had happened. Co-owners. She looked over her shoulder toward the back hallway where Lionel had disappeared with the manager. He hadn't told her about any investment, not even a hint. And Lionel wasn't the type to keep things from her, not out of secrecy at least, but he was the type to stay quiet until something mattered, until it made a point. And this made a point. The server cleared his throat gently. "May I offer you a drink?" "Mom, something to start." Tasha turned slowly. His voice was soft, careful, respectful, the complete opposite of Chet's earlier tone. She considered for a moment, then nodded once. "Sparkling water with lemon." "Yes, ma'am." He disappeared, steps soundless. Her fingers tapped once against the table. She wasn't sure how she felt. She wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. The shock had begun to settle, and beneath it something quieter was building. Not revenge, not even pride, just understanding. They hadn't treated her badly because they knew who she was. They had treated her badly because they didn't. Because when she and Lionel walked in, dressed like any other couple, quiet, reserved, they were easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. Not flashy, not loud, not obviously important, and that apparently made them targets for casual disrespect. The kind people don't even recognize as cruelty, the kind they disguise as policy or procedure, the kind that eats at you slowly while everyone else just continues sipping their wine. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling past messages and news alerts until she found her thread with Lionel. She stared at it for a second, then typed, "So we're owners now." She hit send and waited. No answer yet, probably still in the back. The server returned, placing the tall glass on a small coaster, and bowed his head slightly before stepping away. She picked it up, sipped once, and let the bubbles settle on her tongue. The lemon was fresh, the water cold. Everything about this table screamed luxury, and yet part of her couldn't enjoy it fully. Not with the weight of what had just happened still pressing down on her chest. Because even though they were sitting in the same room now, she and everyone else in that restaurant had not had the same experience. She had earned this table through humiliation. Not through reservation. She had arrived here only after being broken down and rebuilt in front of strangers. She wondered how many people in the room were watching her now. Wondering if she was the reason the floor had shifted. Wondering why the kitchen had gone quiet. Why Chet hadn't come back out. She didn't care. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed. "Lionel, I bought in 6 weeks ago. I wanted to surprise you tonight. Didn't expect it to turn into this." Another message came through before she could respond. "You still okay?" She stared at the words for a long time, and then her fingers moved slowly across the screen. "I'm okay, but I want them to know why it wasn't okay." She put the phone down from her seat. She could just make out the back hallway where Lionel's silhouette was. Now returning, he walked with quiet control, not rushed, not heated. The manager followed behind him, face flushed shoulders, tight eyes darting. She wasn't leading anymore. She was following. Lionel reached the table and pulled out his chair. "They've issued a formal apology," he said as he sat. "To both of us privately and soon to be publicly." Tasha tilted her head, studying him. "And Chet gone for the night," Lionel said. "Maybe longer. That'll be up to the board." She nodded once, then picked up her menu and held it in both hands. "You should have told me." Lionel looked at her, his voice soft. "I wanted tonight to be about us. I didn't think it would have to be about all this." She didn't answer. Not right away. Then she folded the menu closed and placed it on the table. "Well," she said quietly, "it still is." And beneath the candlelight, her hand found his, strong, steady, unshaken. Just like it had for the last 20 years. Their hands stayed clasped across the table longer than either of them realized. No words passed between them for a while, and there was no need. Lionel's thumb moved slowly across Tasha's knuckles, and she let her eyes rest on that simple motion, anchoring herself in it. There was something steadying about his touch, always had been. When she was overwhelmed, when she was uncertain, when she wanted to scream but chose not to, he knew how to ground her without saying a word. But inside her, something still stirred. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even embarrassment anymore. It was exhaustion. The kind that didn't come from work or lack of sleep, but from being reminded over and over that no matter how well you dress, how calmly you speak, how quietly you carry yourself, someone will still look at you and decide you don't belong. All because you don't fit their idea of who deserves to be seen. The restaurant around them had resumed its soft rhythm. Forks clinked, wine glasses chimed. But it wasn't the same as before. Something subtle had shifted. Conversations were quieter. Glances were sharper. People were watching, pretending not to, but failing. A woman 2 tables away had barely touched her plate. A man at the bar kept turning on his stool every few minutes, his brow furrowed as if trying to put the pieces together. Who were these people? Why had the energy changed? And most of all, what did they miss? Tasha noticed it all. Noticed the discomfort, the curiosity, the sudden self-awareness of people who had sat silently while she and Lionel were dismissed. She wasn't angry with them. Not really, but she felt something in her chest. A slow ache, like disappointment, hardened into armor. She looked at Lionel again. He was sipping from a glass of sparkling water, his eyes scanning the room, not urgently, just observing. "I don't want to be the story," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You're not." She gave a small, tired laugh. "I kind of am." Lionel leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on the edge of the table. "Maybe, but only because they wrote the wrong one. And now it's getting corrected." Tasha shook her head, smiling faintly. "You always sound like you rehearsed that." He shrugged, his eyes soft. "I've had practice." A new waiter approached this one, older, more seasoned, wearing a black vest and a silver tie. His hands were steady as he placed 2 fresh menus down, even though they already had some. It was a silent gesture, a way of saying, "You deserve a clean start." He bowed his head slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Benson," he said with quiet respect, "we'd be honored to serve you tonight. Please take your time and let me know when you're ready. The kitchen has been instructed to prioritize your table." Tasha nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you." He stepped away just as carefully as he arrived. Lionel watched him go, then turned back to her. "You don't have to stay, we can still leave." She considered that, the idea of walking out, of leaving behind the memory of that back table near the kitchen, of rejecting all of it, it had a certain appeal. But so did staying, sitting tall in the space they had earned, not through wealth or status, but through dignity, through grace under pressure, through not folding. "No," she said finally, "am not giving them the easy way out." She unfolded her napkin, placed it on her lap, and picked up her glass. Let them watch. Let them see how wrong they were. Lionel gave a small nod, not of approval, but of understanding. He lifted his own glass, and for a brief moment, they clinked together. Not for celebration, but acknowledgement. Then from the hallway near the kitchen, there was movement. Chet stepped back into the dining room. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a wrinkled gray undershirt and black slacks. His apron was gone, his face was flushed, jaw tight, mouth drawn into something between defiance and shame. He didn't walk toward any table. He didn't carry a tray. He just stood near the edge of the bar, eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to leave or apologize or just disappear. Tasha spotted him first. Her expression didn't change. Lionel followed her gaze and turned. Their eyes met Chet's for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. Chet's face broke. He lowered his head, turned, and walked out the door. No confrontation, no speech, no scene, just silence. Tasha exhaled and looked down at her lap. Her hands were steady now. "He won't be back," Lionel said. Tasha didn't answer. She didn't need to, because something deeper had happened. She hadn't won because she owned the restaurant. She hadn't won because someone came in and demanded respect for her. She won because she stayed, and they watched her do it quietly. Unshaken completely. The entrees arrived without delay. 2 servers approached the table at once. Their movements perfectly rehearsed, one laying down a roasted sea bass over creamy herb polenta in front of Tasha, the other placing a thick-cut ribeye before Lionel grilled to medium, as requested. Steam curled upward from the plates, bringing with it a savory scent that filled the space between them. It should have been comforting. It should have made her stomach stir with hunger. But for a moment, Tasha didn't move. Her fork lay still beside her napkin. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, fingers curled together. The fish looked beautiful, seared skin, crisp and golden, draped gently over a bed of soft green-flecked mash. Someone had taken great care preparing it, and yet she couldn't shake the strange tightness lingering in her chest. She watched Lionel as he cut into his steak with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. No hesitation, no show, just calm. But she noticed the slight pause in his movement, the way he looked up after his first bite, checking her face before swallowing. Not in concern, in connection, making sure she was still with him in this moment, not lost in whatever had built up inside her over the last hour. She picked up her fork and took a small bite. The flavors were perfect, delicate, warm, just the right amount of lemon on the fish. But they didn't land the way they should have. Not yet. It was hard to taste joy when your dignity had been a battle. She chewed slowly, then took another sip of water. The glass trembled slightly as she set it down. She glanced at Lionel, hesitated, then finally said it out loud. I feel guilty. He didn't look surprised. He simply set his fork down, wiped the corners of his mouth, and said gently, why Tasha kept her eyes on her plate. Because we're sitting here getting treated like royalty. And everyone else, the people who just watched it happen, they'll go home tonight and forget. Forget what it meant. Forget how it felt to sit there and be ignored. They'll remember a scene, an awkward night, a weird shift in energy, but not us. Not what we felt. Lionel let the silence settle before answering. They might forget, he said, but you won't, and neither will I. She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of that. He continued, it's not your job to teach them anything. It's not your job to fix what they chose not to see. You showed up, you were decent, and they made a choice. That's on them. Tasha pressed her lips together. I know it's just. It's not the first time, he gave a sad smile. No, and it won't be the last. She looked out the window again, where the street was now darker, headlights from passing cars streaking over the glass. She could see the reflection of the dining room in the pane, the outline of diners chatting, the faint movements of forks rising and falling, the subtle glances that still came their way, though less frequently now. It wasn't scrutiny anymore, just awareness, an uncomfortable one. Do you think they felt bad? She asked. Lionel followed her gaze. Some did, and the rest. He sipped his water and set the glass down carefully. The rest just felt seen, and they didn't like it. Tasha laughed softly under her breath. Not out of humor, but out of recognition. That was exactly it. People like stories where justice came wrapped in a bow. Quick, clean, dramatic. But when justice showed up quiet with polite hands and a tired smile, it made people shift in their seats. It made them wonder what they had ignored, what they had allowed. Their server returned to clear the first course plates and refill their glasses, never once breaking eye contact, never once rushing. The care was evident now, real, not performative. But Tasha could still feel that invisible question hanging in the room. What do you do when you realize you've been complicit? You avoid, you overcompensate, or you stay quiet and hope the memory fades. But for Tasha, this one wouldn't fade. It would stay, as all of them did. Quietly folded into her memory, not as bitterness, but as armor. Because it wasn't just about being denied service. It was about being denied value, denied existence. And the thing that hurt most was knowing that if Lionel had a financial stake, they would have walked out that door and nothing would have changed. She looked at him now across the flickering candlelight and saw the man who had sat beside her in silence, who had held back his fire long enough to let the truth speak for itself, who didn't need to shout to be heard, and who had waited patiently to pull the lever when it mattered. He met her gaze, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with something steady and unwavering. This is yours too, he said. She tilted her head. This space, this table. This respect, it's not just mine. You earned it. Tash, you always have. A tightness bloomed in her throat, the kind that only loosened when someone saw you fully and told you they saw you. She blinked once, swallowed and nodded. Then she picked up her knife and fork again, and this time the food tasted like it was meant to. Dinner moved on, courses came and went in a quiet rhythm, a warm beet salad with crumbled goat cheese, then a light sorbet, followed by coffee poured tableside. The flavors were good, the service attentive, and the atmosphere returned to its calm, curated elegance. But the weight of what had happened earlier still lived beneath the surface, like a current just under the floorboards, steady and unresolved. Tasha leaned back in her chair, slowly swirling what remained of her espresso, watching the liquid form a lazy spiral inside the white porcelain. Her shoulders had finally loosened, but her mind had not fully across from her. Lionel sat with a faint smile, his gaze half focused on her, half on the window beside them. The rain had stopped, and the city outside glowed under streetlights and reflections. It should have felt peaceful. A perfect end to an evening meant to celebrate 20 years together. But now it felt like two anniversaries had collided, one for their marriage, quiet, intimate, built on time and trust, and another one neither of them asked for, marking yet another chapter in the long, invisible story of being underestimated, Tasha didn't speak right away. When she finally did, it was barely above a whisper. Do you ever get tired of being reminded? Lionel looked at her eyebrows low. Reminded of what? That we have to earn basic decency. She said, her voice steady, but her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the coaster. That we walk into a place like this and have to prove. We belong, that being good, polite, prepared. None of it matters until someone realizes you own part of the building. Lionel sighed long and slow. Yeah, he said, I do. His honesty made her chest ache. Every time I shake a hand and I see that flicker of surprise. Every time someone calls me sir a little too late. Every time someone hears my name on email and meets my skin in person. He paused. I get tired, but I don't get quiet. That last line landed like a stone in her stomach. Tasha nodded slowly, lips pressing together. She looked down at her hands, remembering how they trembled earlier when she sat alone at the back table near the kitchen. How hard it had been to hold her composure when all she really wanted to do was leave, to vanish, to not be there for that moment at all. But now she was still here, and not just here, but present, seen. Even if it had taken power to make them look. She set down her cup. I didn't think I needed to be reminded tonight, she said. Not on a night like this. Lionel didn't offer a solution. He just nodded slowly. They shouldn't have made you feel small, he said. They didn't, she replied. Not really. They made themselves small. I just had to sit through it. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and she hated that it did. But Lionel didn't flinch. He simply reached across the table again. Not dramatically, just enough for their fingertips to meet. And then the silence came, not uncomfortable, not loud, but full. Tasha sat with it. Let herself feel it. Let herself be in it. Because she realized something important in that moment. Something she hadn't quite put into words until now. They hadn't come to this restaurant looking for respect. They had come to celebrate each other. But the fact that respect had to be forced into the room, that it had to be earned, even when it was owed, that was what stung the most. Still, they hadn't left. They had stayed. They had been still, and they had waited, and eventually the room caught up to them. The check was brought over without prompt in a leather folio with a small gold logo pressed into the corner. But instead of placing it between them, the server carefully leaned toward Lionel and whispered, Mr. Carter has asked that this evening be taken care of in full with his personal thanks. Lionel didn't even glance at the receipt. He simply nodded once and passed it back. No, he said softly. Well, cover it. The waiter blinked. Sir, are you? Lionel looked up, calm, steady. If I don't pay tonight, it becomes charity. I'd rather it just be dinner. The waiter paused, then nodded in understanding and stepped away. Tasha looked at him, a smile playing faintly at the edge of her lips. You didn't want the free meal? Lionel returned the smile. I wanted the choice. That's the difference. She chuckled, and for the first time that evening, it sounded light, real, like the weight was finally beginning to lift. They stood from the table together. Lionel helped her with her coat, slow, careful, the same way he had since their very first date. And as they turned toward the front of the restaurant, a hush followed their steps again. Not fearful, not awkward, but watchful. They passed table after table of people who had seen a version of themselves reflected tonight. People who maybe hadn't said anything earlier, who maybe hadn't done anything wrong but had also not done anything right. And now they had to sit in that silence, the same way Tasha had once sat in hers. And just before stepping through the front door, Tasha paused and turned her head. Chet was gone. The manager was nowhere in sight. But the hostess, the same one who had greeted the others before them, stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was pale, eyes focused downward. But when she looked up and met Tasha's eyes, something shifted, a tiny nod, small, barely there. But it wasn't enough. Tasha didn't smile back. She didn't nod in return. She simply turned and walked through the door, her husband beside her. And this time, when the bell above the door chimed, it didn't sound sharp or lonely. It sounded like closure. The night air wrapped around them like a quiet answer, cool, damp, and still smelling faintly of asphalt and jasmine from the planter boxes that lined the sidewalk. A light breeze lifted the edges of Tasha's coat as she and Lionel stepped away from the restaurants, glow, their heels and soles clicking gently on the wet pavement. Behind them, the windows still shimmered warm and golden, a place where laughter and clinking glasses continued without them. But it no longer mattered. That space had already become a memory, one that would stay whether they wanted it to or not. Tasha slipped her arm through Lionel's as they walked. She didn't say anything for the first few steps. Her heart had slowed now. Her thoughts had not. She looked up at the sky. No stars, just a silver blur of clouds stretching across the city skyline. Everything above felt heavier than usual, or maybe that was just inside her. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. Lionel adjusted his pace to match hers, silent, steady, always her anchor. He knew without needing to ask that she was still turning it over in her mind, still sorting through the parts of the night that hadn't fit, the parts that had stuck, the parts that shouldn't have been part of their story in the first place. She exhaled slowly. "It's strange," she said, finally breaking the quiet. "What is feeling proud and exhausted at the same time?" He gave a small nod but didn't answer. "I didn't do anything dramatic." She continued, her voice just above a whisper. "I didn't stand up or cause a scene or demand anything. And yet my body feels like it just walked through a storm because it did." Lionel said, "You just held your umbrella tighter than most." That made her smile, not because it was clever, but because it was true. And hearing it come from him in that calm, matter-of-fact way, he had helped something inside her settle. They walked a little farther, passing quiet storefronts, the glass dark and the doors locked. The city felt emptied of noise now, as if the world had paused to let them decompress. Only the hush of tires over wet roads echoed around them. "I kept thinking," Tasha said slowly, "about how close we came to just walking out. I know, and if we'd left and never said anything, they would have told themselves a different story. One where we were the problem, or one where nothing happened at all." "They still might," Lionel replied. "Some people will always rewrite things to feel better. But we didn't leave," she said, firmer now. "No," he agreed, "we didn't." She looked at him, eyes serious. "And you planned all of this." He paused. "Not this exactly. I planned dinner. A surprise I wanted to tell you after dessert, thought it might make you laugh. By the way, you now own part of this overpriced risotto." She let out a soft, genuine laugh at that. "But I didn't plan the rest," he added, his voice quieter now. "Didn't plan for you to be humiliated. Didn't plan to have to use the ownership card just to get us treated like people." Tasha reached up and touched his arm. "But you didn't use it right away." "No," he said, "because I wanted to see what they'd do first." She nodded slowly, her thumb brushing against his coat. "I think that's what stayed with me the most. You watched it happen, you let it play out." He met her eyes, "Not because I liked it, because I needed to know how they'd act when they thought we were powerless. And I learned everything I needed." That answer landed deep in her chest, sharp, clean, honest. It made her think of all the times she had swallowed her own discomfort to keep a situation smooth. All the times she'd let things go to avoid being labeled difficult or sensitive. But tonight had been different. Tonight they had just been witnesses to quiet disrespect. They had forced the room to see them, really see them, without ever raising their voices. She stopped walking and looked out across the parking lot ahead, where their car sat under the dim light of a street lamp. "Do you think people like Chet ever change?" she asked. Lionel followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "Some do, and the rest. They learn to be quieter about their bias, hide it behind rules and manners. That's worse," he shrugged. "It's not new." She turned toward him fully now, arms crossed loosely in front of her. "You're not surprised. You were never surprised. I've lived long enough not to be," he said simply. There was no anger in his voice, just fatigue, the kind that came from too many repetitions of the same pattern. Tasha stared at him, and for a moment she didn't see the man across from her, the father of her children, the business partner, the husband. She saw the boy he must have once been, the teenager who probably sat at lunch tables where no one joined him, the young man who walked into boardrooms and had to prove himself 5 different ways before he was allowed to speak. He had learned how to carry himself with armor, but it was still armor. "You know," she said softly, "I don't think I would have had the strength to say anything if it had been just me tonight." He reached for her hand again, fingers threading through hers. "That's why I was there. And in those 5 words, everything was said. They reached the car. Lionel unlocked it, then opened the passenger door for her, like he always did, with ease, with habit, with care. She slid in and he closed it gently before walking around to his side. As the engine started and the headlights lit the road ahead, Tasha leaned her head back against the seat, watching the restaurant fade into the background through the rearview mirror. No part of her wished they'd made a bigger scene. No part of her regretted staying, because tonight wasn't just about being served a meal. It was about finally being recognized in a room that tried not to look, and now they would never be invisible there again. The car moved slowly down the slick street, the tires whispering over the wet pavement. Inside, the silence stretched out between them, soft and full. Not awkward, but dense, like the kind of quiet that only comes after something heavy has passed through. Tasha stared out her window, watching the street lamps flicker across puddles and storefront glass. She wasn't tired, but her body felt the kind of deep ache that didn't come from movement. It came from holding in too much, from keeping still when your instincts screamed to stand, from biting down on words until your jaw hurt. Her hand rested lightly on the door handle, fingers occasionally tapping. She wasn't aware she was doing it. Lionel drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, steady, focused not just on the road, but on her. The way she hadn't moved much, the way she kept glancing back at the restaurant until it was out of view. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she finally said. "It's like my body is home, but my mind's still in that room." He nodded his eyes, never leaving the road. "That makes sense." Tasha looked down at her lap. "I didn't expect it to feel so personal." It was personal, but they didn't know who we were. They didn't know anything about us. They didn't need to, Lionel said quietly. "That's the part that hurts most." She sat with that truth for a while, because it wasn't just about the table, or the tone, or even the waiter. It was about the fact that she could have been anyone, that the moment wasn't unique, that there were likely dozens, maybe hundreds of stories just like theirs unfolding in other places, on other nights, in other corners of the world, without the part where someone walks in and says, "Actually, they own this place." She folded her arms and rested them in her lap. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we didn't have power?" Lionel looked at her just for a second. "I think about that all the time. And I think we've lived it. Most of our lives, this was just one time we had leverage." She turned toward him, really studying his face now. The slight crease between his brows, the quiet pull of his mouth. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. But something in his voice sounded older than usual, worn. "You carried that with you the whole night, didn't you?" she asked. "What, the knowledge? The fact that you could have ended it whenever you wanted?" Lionel exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. "Yeah, then why didn't you?" His grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Not enough to show tension, just enough to show care. Because I needed you to see what they would do when they thought we had no voice," he said. "And I needed them to show themselves first." Tasha looked away again, out at the quiet houses and dark trees. "I hate that," she whispered. "I hate that we have to think that way. That you have to hold back just to let people reveal how low they're willing to go. I know I hate that being right feels like a burden sometimes." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The car turned onto a narrower street, their neighborhood, familiar porches, dim porch, lights, flower pots sagging in the rain. It should have felt like exhale, but something in her chest was still tight. "I wanted to cry when we got there," she said suddenly, voice shaking. Lionel glanced over. "I held it in." She continued, "Because I didn't want them to think I was weak or dramatic or angry. I didn't want to be that woman." He reached over, then resting a hand gently over hers, stopping the restless tapping. "You weren't weak," he said softly. "You were composed, but I didn't feel strong." She admitted, "I felt small. I felt stupid for not walking out. And even now I keep replaying it. What I could have said, what I should have said." "You said enough, just by staying," he interrupted. His words were so firm, so certain that for a moment she couldn't speak. He parked the car in front of their house, engine humming quietly before he turned it off. The headlights swept across their front steps and went dark. The world went quieter. Tasha stared at the house. The porch light was on. The curtains still open, a crack in the front window. Their home hadn't changed, but tonight had shifted something, and she couldn't quite name what it was. Lionel rested back in his seat watching her. "You did something most people wouldn't," he said. "You let yourself be seen, not just by them, but by yourself. You didn't walk away. You didn't explode. You stayed." She closed her eyes. It didn't feel brave. "Bravery doesn't feel like bravery when you're living it," he said. "It just feels like survival." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes then. Not from sadness, not from defeat, but from release. From having someone say the exact words she hadn't known she needed. She reached for him across the console, and he leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. Their eyes closed, the air between them, warm and still. "We didn't just survive that room," she whispered. "We shifted it." "Yes," he said, "we did." They stayed like that for a while. Forehead to forehead, breath to breath, before finally stepping out of the car and into the quiet night. And this time the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like peace. The front door clicked shut behind them with a familiar softness. Tasha dropped her keys in the ceramic dish near the entryway, the tiny chime of metal on porcelain echoing briefly in the still house. It was quiet, not the kind of silence that followed a storm, but the kind that made space for reflection. A silence with weight. Lionel slipped off his coat and hung it neatly by the door the way he always did. Tasha watched him for a second before taking off her heels one at a time, wincing slightly as she flexed her sore toes. The moment her feet touched the cool hardwood, a small exhale left her body, the kind that only came from letting your guard down finally fully. She padded into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch. Lionel followed, loosening his collar as he sat beside her. The lamp in the corner cast a soft glow across the room, spilling warm light across the beige carpet and the framed photos on the wall. Their daughters now grown frozen in smiling childhood poses. One of them in front of the science fair board, the other in a dance costume mid-spin. Tasha looked at the pictures for a long moment. "They don't know what it costs," she murmured. Lionel glanced at her. "To move through the world like this," she said, motioning loosely with her hand. "To smile when you're being dismissed, to act unbothered when you're being watched, to stand still when everything inside you wants to scream." "They'll find out," Lionel said softly. "They'll feel it in their own ways. I don't want them to, I know," he said. "But that's the hardest part of loving them. We can stop the world from mistaking them. We can only help them name the feeling when it comes." Tasha let those words sit for a moment. She thought of their daughters, bright, funny, fierce in ways that made her proud and anxious all at once. She pictured them sitting at tables like the ones she sat at tonight, being judged before they ordered, being corrected when they hadn't done anything wrong. She leaned back on the couch and rested her head on the cushion, staring at the ceiling. "I used to think dignity came from walking away," she said, "from not lowering yourself to someone else's ignorance." "It can, but tonight it felt different." How she paused, thinking. Tonight, dignity felt like staying, like being present for every second of their discomfort, like letting them see me sit there calm and quiet while they folded in on themselves. Lionel nodded. "That's a kind of power they don't teach you about. I didn't know I had it." "You always did," he said. "You just never needed to use it like that." Before she was quiet for a long stretch. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filled the space between them. Somewhere outside a dog barked once, then nothing. Tasha turned toward him, voice lower now. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it, owning things like that, buying into places that don't really want us there, not until they need our money or our name?" Lionel didn't answer right away. He looked at the fireplace, the darkened frame of it, the mantel still decorated with a few cards from their anniversary, some from friends, one from their daughter's, handwritten and taped shut with pink glitter tape. Then he said, "Yes, I wonder all the time." She raised an eyebrow. "But then I remember," he continued, "that owning something isn't about being wanted. It's about not needing permission. It's about not waiting for a seat anymore, not hoping someone will make room. It's about building your own table and then deciding who gets to sit with you." Tasha breathed in deep. "Let it out slowly. I just didn't want tonight to be about proving something. It did not feel like a celebration." No, Lionel said, but it felt like a turning point that landed hard in her chest. He was right. It wasn't the night they imagined. No shared dessert, no nostalgic laughter over wine, no sentimental toast to years gone by. But it was something else. It was a story they would tell. Maybe not right away, maybe not even to their kids, but one day when someone asked what it meant to stand your ground, without raising your voice, they'd have this. They'd have the night when respect was dragged into the light and made to hold its shape. Tasha sat up straighter. Her back ached slightly, but she didn't complain. I think she said slowly, "What hurts the most is that no one in that room did anything. All those people, all those eyes, and not one voice said, 'This isn't right.'" Lionel looked at her, his expression steady, because they didn't want to risk being uncomfortable. People will sit through a lot if it means keeping their seat. She blinked. "But that doesn't mean they didn't see you," he added. "And it doesn't mean they'll forget." A long pause passed. Then Tasha nodded. "No," she said. "I don't think they will." She reached for his hand again, lacing her fingers through his, the same way she had during funerals, during births, during quiet mornings when the world outside their window felt like too much. And for a while they just sat there, two people in the soft light of their home, not victorious, not bitter, just present in the truth that they had weathered something ugly and made it through intact and stronger, even if they were tired, especially because they were tired. The next morning arrived quietly, the sun leaking in through the linen curtains in faint gold streaks. Tasha stirred first, blinking into the soft blur of daylight. Her body was still, but her mind had already started moving, not with urgency, not with the anxiety that sometimes greets her before her feet hit the floor, but with a kind of subdued heaviness, like something had shifted overnight and now everything felt just slightly out of place, like a painting tilted on a wall. She stayed in bed for a few minutes longer, listening to the low hum of the heating system. Lionel was still asleep beside her, one arm folded behind his head, his breathing deep and steady. He looked peaceful, unbothered, or maybe just practiced. He had always been better at carrying heaviness without showing it. Tasha sat up and ran a hand through her hair. Her body ached faintly, the kind of ache that came from too much emotional tension, packed into a single evening. Her chest still held traces of the tension from last night, even though the worst of it had passed. But beneath it there was something else now. Not pain, not anger. It was reflection. She pulled on her robe and padded into the kitchen barefoot, the tile cool against her feet. The house smelled faintly of coffee. The timer on the pot had done its job. She poured herself a cup and stood by the sink, letting the steam rise into her face as she watched the street outside. It was quiet. Normal, a jogger passed. Hoodie pulled tight earbuds in. A neighbor across the way was walking his dog, leash in one hand, phone in the other. A delivery truck rumbled by slowly, the driver sipping from a thermos. The world outside hadn't changed, and yet Tasha didn't cry. She didn't sigh, she just stood there holding her coffee, absorbing the quiet like it was medicine. Last night's scene kept playing in the background of her mind, the uncomfortable glances, the silence from other diners. The way Chet's voice had shifted from smugness to panic once Lionel revealed who he was. And more than anything, the look on that hostess's face when they left. That faint flicker of guilt, too little too late. She had thought for years that moments like that wouldn't shake her anymore. She'd worked too hard, grown too much. She was past it. But the truth was, every time it happened, every time someone looked past her, or through her, or down at her, it chipped something invisible. Something quiet. Something that didn't bleed but still hurt, and last night had been one more chip. She took a sip of coffee, then leaned against the counter. Her mind drifted to her daughters, to the conversations they hadn't yet had, the warnings she hadn't wanted to give, the stories she'd tucked away because she wanted them to believe the world could be fair. But maybe it was time to be honest. Not cruel, not bitter, just honest. The hallway creaked behind her. Lionel appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his t-shirt wrinkled from sleep. He looked at her, blinking slowly. "Already up?" he asked, voice hoarse. She nodded, managing a soft smile. "Just thinking." He walked over, pressed a quick kiss to her forehead, and reached for a mug, They stood side by side in the quiet for a few moments, sipping. Then he glanced at her, still sitting with it. Yeah, you want to talk more? She considered it, then nodded. Not about what happened, about what it meant. Lionel leaned against the counter facing her now, coffee cradled in both hands. All right, I used to think that dignity meant being untouched, Tasha said. Like if I didn't let them get to me, then they hadn't won. But last night I realized it's not about being untouched. It's about what you do after they touch you, after they try to shrink you. He nodded, listening. And I didn't shrink, she continued, her voice steadier now. Even when I wanted to, even when everything in me told me to just leave. That's strength, Lionel said. She smiled faintly. No, that's clarity. It's the moment when you realize you're not asking to be accepted anymore. You're demanding to be acknowledged. They were quiet again. Then Lionel reached into the drawer beside them and pulled out a folded envelope, ivory elegant with a handwritten note across the front. Tasha opened after dinner. He handed it to her, her eyebrows raised. You had this last night, he nodded. Didn't feel like the right time anymore. She unfolded it gently. Inside was a card, and inside the card was a simple line in Lionel's handwriting. We've built so much together, a home, a life, a name. They can ignore. I know the world doesn't always treat you the way it should, but I see you, Tasha, always fully, and that's never changed. Underneath, tucked inside the card, was a document, a formal share transfer. 25% of the restaurant's ownership now legally in her name. Her fingers froze on the paper. Her chest went still. You, she began. Lionel shrugged softly. It was always ours. I just made it official. Tasha blinked, the sting behind her eyes catching her off guard. I didn't ask for this, I know, he said. That's why it matters. Her throat tightened. She looked down at the paper again. The signature still fresh, the weight of it sinking in. It wasn't just about ownership. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about voice, presence, power that didn't need to shout because it had already been earned. Tasha folded the document carefully, then reached out and placed her hand over Lionel's. Then let's use it, she said. He tilted his head to do what. She looked out the window, then back at him. Eyes, clear voice, steady, to make sure no one else leaves that place feeling invisible again. And in that moment, something inside her shifted, not broken, not bruised. Rebuilt on her terms. The day unfolded slowly, like soft pages turning without hurry. Tasha spent the morning moving through the house with a kind of gentle purpose. Watering the potted plants by the kitchen window, folding the laundry still warm from the dryer, tidying small corners that didn't really need it. She didn't play music. She didn't turn on the television. The quiet was enough. It helped her think. The document Lionel had given her, the official share transfer, now sat on her nightstand, placed there carefully, like something sacred. Every time she passed the bedroom, she glanced at it, a flutter rising in her chest. Not pride exactly, not even power. Something more personal. Ownership, not of a thing, but of how she wanted to exist in the world. She kept replaying his words in her head. It was always ours. I just made it official. That was Lionel, always a step ahead, always laying foundation under her feet before she even knew she'd need to stand on it. She thought about the restaurant, the layout of the dining room, the corner where they had been seated near the kitchen doors, that forgotten space. She thought about the faces of the staff, the coldness in Chet's eyes, the stiffness in the manager's, apologies the way the hostess finally looked at her near the end. And she thought about the diners. How easily they had chosen to stay silent. She could walk away from all of it, sign the document, let it sit, collected dividends from afar, and never step foot in the place again. But something about that felt incomplete. So just after noon, she opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered for a moment above the keyboard before she began to type. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each word chosen carefully, each line short and clear. She wasn't writing a complaint. She was writing an instruction, an invitation, a reconstruction. When she finished, she printed 3 copies, folded them, slipped each one into an envelope, and placed them neatly in her bag. Later that afternoon, she changed into a navy blouse and gray slacks. Not flashy, not formal, but firm. She tied her curls back, left her heels behind, and slipped on flats. Practical, ready, focused. Lionel stood by the front door, holding the keys waiting. "You sure you want to do this today?" he asked. "Yes, you don't know them anything?" "I know," she said. "But I owe myself something." He didn't press. He just handed her the keys and followed her outside. The drive to the restaurant was quiet but not tense. Tasha kept her gaze forward, her thoughts weaving between memory and action. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't angry, she was ready. And that feeling, that clarity, was something she had known she needed until now. They pulled up to the side lot, not the main entrance. Tasha didn't want a grand arrival. She wanted something that belonged to her, quiet, direct, unavoidable. Inside the restaurant was between lunch and dinner rush. A few servers cleaned tables. The air smelled of roasted garlic and something sweet. Maybe a reduction sauce simmering in the back. The manager, the same one from the night before, was at the bar reviewing receipts. He looked up when she entered. His expression flickered surprise, discomfort, then careful politeness. "Mrs. Carter," he said, rising quickly. "I was expecting." "No," she said gently. "You weren't." She handed him the envelope. "This is for you. There are 2 others, one for Chet and one for the general staff meeting tomorrow." He hesitated before taking it. "Is this instructions?" she said. "A few small changes, nothing disruptive, just policy clarity, cultural accountability, inclusion training, a restructure of how seating assignments are handled, and a new zero-tolerance policy for coded discrimination." He blinked, "and a small bonus pool," she added, "for the first team member who demonstrates proactive inclusivity and is nominated by a guest for it." The manager's jaw tense, then softened. "Understood." She wasn't finished. "I want the back 2 tables moved to the front window," she said, "and the ones by the kitchen reassigned to overflow. Only people deserve to be seen, especially those who've been trained to expect the shadows." The manager nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom," and she said, voice calm but firm. "I want a table permanently reserved every 3rd Friday. Nameplate Carter." "Yes, Mom." She didn't look for guilt in his face. She didn't look for apology. She wasn't here for that. Tasha turned and walked through the restaurant slowly. The staff had started to notice her. A few paused what they were doing. One hostess, not the girl from last night, but another young woman with a notepad in hand, offered a small, curious smile. Tasha gave her one back. She stood for a moment in the very spot where she had waited the night before, where she had sat unseen for 20 long minutes near the swinging kitchen doors. She didn't touch the table. She just stood there. And then she moved to the front corner. She placed one hand on the window, tracing the glass lightly before stepping back and nodding to herself. "This one," she said, "the new table. The one no one would ever have to earn again." On her way out, she passed by a small chalkboard near the bar. It listed the specials: pan-seared, halibut risotto, lemon tart. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded note, and clipped it gently to the board. It read, "Respect is seasonal. Serve it with every plate." She left without another word. Outside, Lionel waited by the car. He raised an eyebrow as she approached. "Well," he asked. "It's done," she said. He opened the door for her. She slid in as the car pulled away. She glanced once more at the restaurant in the rearview mirror. But this time, it didn't feel like a place that had hurt her. It felt like a place she had claimed. And from now on, anyone who walked through its doors wouldn't just taste food. They'd taste the difference. The following Friday, the late summer sun began its slow descent behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the pavement and washing the streets in a soft golden hue. Tasha stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the silver clasp on her bracelet. Her fingers moved with care. Not out of nervousness, but intention. She wore a deep olive blouse, one of her favorites, soft and structured, with quiet elegance. Her slacks were pressed, her shoes low and comfortable. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just present. Just herself. Lionel entered the room behind her, tightening the cuffs of his dress shirt. He paused when he saw her, his reflection catching hers in the mirror. "You look exactly right," he said. Tasha gave a small smile. "That's how I feel." They drove slowly, no music, just the occasional exchange of quiet thoughts. Grocery list reminders, notes about their daughter's upcoming visit, mention of a book Tasha had started reading again. But between the small talk sat something unspoken, the weight of what tonight meant, not as an event, not even as a milestone, but as a restoration. The restaurant came into view just as the sky turned amber. It looked the same, and yet not at all. The front windows gleamed. The new hostess, the same one who had smiled gently, last time stood behind the podium, straight-backed and poised. Inside, soft jazz hummed through the speakers. Candles flickered on the tables as they entered, heads turned. Not in spectacle, but recognition. And by the front window, the brightest corner once reserved for someone else's, comfort, a table sat waiting. A small bronze nameplate gleamed at the edge. Reserved the Carter table. They were greeted instantly, not with overdone sweetness, but with simple, sincere respect. The hostess led them to the table without fanfare. The menus were already placed. The silverware shined. Their server approached a young man named Darren Kinneard, steady-voiced. He introduced himself and offered them drinks. He didn't linger, didn't hover, but acknowledged them fully equally. Tasha looked around the room slowly. It was fuller than usual, but quieter. Something about the air felt changed. Maybe it was the new layout, the open space near the front, the adjusted table flow, or maybe it was that people were now sitting where they could be seen, no longer tucked away based on assumptions that never belonged. Their meals came without delay. The food was perfect, warm, balanced, thoughtful, but that wasn't what made her hands relax around the fork. What made her exhale deep and slow was the peace. She wasn't waiting for the room to change. It already had. Halfway through dinner, a couple approached their table. Middle-aged, well-dressed with a gentle presence. The woman whose skin was the shade of cedar and eyes kind smiled at Tasha. "I hope you don't mind me saying," she began, "but I read about what happened here, and I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the ownership, for the shift. We've been coming here for years. This place, it feels different now in the right way." Tasha stood, slowly shook her hand. "Thank you, that means more than you know." The woman nodded, then added softly, "We never thought we'd see someone like us shape a space like this and do it with grace." Tasha held her gaze. "We didn't ask for grace. We just gave ourselves permission to stay." They exchanged a knowing look, that quiet acknowledgement only shared between those who've carried the same invisible weight, and then the couple returned to their table. Lionel reached for her hand across the table. She took it without hesitation. As dessert came, lemon tart just as she liked it. Tasha let her gaze drift to the window, where the last light of day softened the room. The warmth on her skin wasn't just from the sun anymore. It was from being seen, from taking a moment that was meant to diminish her and turning it into something that would outlast the memory. She thought about her younger self, the girl who once sat quietly at the back of classrooms, who learned to lower her voice so she wouldn't be called too much. The woman who smiled through microaggressions in meetings, who shrank herself just enough to keep a seat at someone else's table. And now she owned the table. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, out of truth, out of choosing again and again not to disappear. As the candles burned lower and the restaurant hummed softly around them, Tasha leaned back in her chair and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not power, but peace, earned quiet and completely hers. And in that moment, she didn't need to look ahead or already knew this wasn't just about a table. It was about never asking for a seat again. This wasn't just a story about quiet racism. It was about quiet strength, about standing your ground without ever raising your voice. If this story touched you, please give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real powerful stories like this one.